Me.
Mowed it yesterday and there's already spikes.
I hate that. The rest of the grass is still short, but that crabgrass makes your lawn look like it hasn't been mowed forever.
Good evening, everybody.
Evening.
Good to see everybody. Nice to have some a little bit nicer weather. I'm hoping maybe some more rain will come through tonight. That would be nice. But hope everybody is doing well. Hope your bees are doing well. Hope your management through summer. I hope you had an abundance of honey harvest. Some have had really good years this year, and some have had, not such a good year. But it's been a good summer through my bee yard. Everything has been pretty well, so I hope the same thing is what you're dealing with too. If you're new with us tonight, welcome. It's great to have any new faces and visitors, and I'd say don't forget to reach out. Any friends, you hear your friends when they hear you talking about your bees, and because I know they've got lots of questions, and I know that you don't have any problems standing there and talking to them for a long time about the bees. But mention to them, just say, hey, why don't you come join us, one of our meetings, come see some of this is all about. And it doesn't cost them anything to come and just meet good folk that are here. And but as we get going on through this next month and into next month, we got a few things that are coming up. And so as far as our there's just some dates, things that are happening. October 1st is going to be our next field day, Saturday, October 1st. Every October we do a field day where we go through the process of making fondant and candy boards and things like that as we're getting ready, preparing for winter. And so if that's something that you have not been here or been a part of as we're doing, or you want to refresh on it, kind of see again, you will go home most likely with either some fondant or something as well, because we usually make a little bit, enough for people to take with them. October 6th, of course, will be our monthly meeting in October. November 3rd, we want to remind everybody that in our November meeting, we will be having our board member and our officer elections for the next year. We will be getting more information out about the process as we come up to that in the next couple months. But if you would like to serve in any way, then Sean, are we going to do something for them to submit if they are interested in? We've done it a couple of different ways, either just kind of by verbal, somebody come up and say, hey, I'd like to be president, or we'll probably send something out to allow you to respond if there is something that you would like to be a part of. Those are I'll show you all the different positions that we have. We are doing a fall beginner class, November 12th. So again, all those friends that are interested in what you're doing, tell them, hey, go take a class and just see what it's all about, and it might be something you want to do. December 1st, we've changed this. The board we kind of switched a couple of things around to where we will have a November meeting. It used to be in November we'd have a potluck and we would have no meeting at all in December. What we're going to do, we will have a meeting in November, and then we're going to do our annual potluck. Just get together. It's a non-official meeting, just a time to get together and spend some time together. December 1st, so that'll be that Thursday, first Thursday in December. Here are the positions that we will be electing for. Every position is just a one-year term. And so we have two members at large on our board, event coordinator, treasurer, secretary, vice president, and president. And so all of those are up for either re-election or for a new election. So there's something on there. I can guarantee you, people who have done it for a long time would probably like somebody to say, hey, why don't I take that for a year and help out in some way. If you have any questions about any of those, let us know. And we'd love to have you working along with us. University of Arkansas is also putting on their annual Insect Festival. And John Z is going to be the one that is now in charge of the beekeeping part of this event on October 27th. He has reached out to us to ask if there's anyone who'd be willing to volunteer, not for that whole time during the day, but maybe for a couple hours or a few hours during the day to come by and as people come through and just ask questions about bees and beekeeping. And so if you would be interested in being a part of that, let us know, and we will let John know, and we'll get you more information about all of that as well. It looks like it's going to be a fun event. It's insects in general, but there will be a specific area for beekeepers and beekeeping to be a part of that as well. There's information about our class on November 12th, the costs for the class, and the dates and times and everything. And so we'll make up some flyers and things like this as well. We'll post them to the Facebook page so you can share it out to others too. But anybody, once we get it up, the registration's not up quite yet for it, but it will be very shortly. And as soon as it is, you can send people to our website, and they'll be able to register there.
Who's going to be giving the class?
I will. I'll be doing that class. Good. All right. Well, our topic for the evening is winter prep and feeding. And when it's still balmy 90 degrees outside, it kind of seems like it's kind of a strange topic to be talking about. But we're just coming off of our honey harvest, and it is time to start getting ready. And for those that are newer, we try in our monthly meetings and topics to be a month or two ahead of what we need to be doing. This really isn't a month or two ahead, because this is what we need to start preparing for now. But these are some things that we want to make sure that we're ahead of the curve with the things that are coming in your beekeeping calendar. And so we want to make sure that you're prepared and ready. When it comes to winter, this is the most stressful time of the year for our bees. And everything, all of that stress is all dependent on what type of weather we have throughout the winter. And so as honeybees are the only insect that create that self-sustaining the atmosphere that they live in, that microclimate that they live in all through the winter. There aren't any other insects that do it like honeybees. And so there are specific things that we have to make sure that they have in an abundance of food, making sure that their environment, our hives are in the condition that they need to be in as we get ready to go into the cold months. And so survival is dependent on a lot of things, though. And some of those things we don't have any control over. And one of those is the weather. The severity of any given winter. It determines a lot. We've talked a lot about Northwest Arkansas. Beekeeping here, it's different than it is if you're down in the river valley. Beekeeping here, where the weather fluctuates in a lot of different ways, and winters can be a challenge, because today it might be 70 degrees in the middle of December, and tomorrow it's going to be 10. And then 3 days later, it's going to be 65. And that's not an ideal thing for bees, to have those fluctuations like that. It'd be so much better if we could just have 32 degrees and stay 32 degrees for about 4 months, and then we get spring. That's not the way it works around here. It'd be a whole lot easier on the bees if it did, but it doesn't. So if we'll just do some of the minimum things to help our bees out, it will make a big difference. So those are the kind of things that we want to try to talk about tonight. But what's going on in our hives? As the temperatures begin to get lower and lower and lower, here's kind of what is beginning to take place. When we drop down to where our temperatures are around 65 degrees, we're to a point now that queens are not going to fly, which means they're at this point, queens are not going to be going out on mating flights. It's just too cold for them to get out and to fly. But that's all right, because it's not much cooler when drones will not fly. So at 61 degrees is when we know that drones quit going out on their mating flights as well. So it's around that temperature, when our temperatures get down around 60 degrees, that if there are any drones left in your hives, they won't be there for long, because all the workers are starting to kick them out, and literally dragging them out, screaming, and which is, if you haven't seen it, it's one of the neat little things of watching the bees, is watching the workers drag a drone that doesn't want to leave out of the hive. So that's about the temperatures that these things are happening. When the temperature drops to 57 degrees, this is when we begin to really start seeing the clusters start to form. So if we have temperatures that drop down into the mid-50s at night, then you're going to start having clusters form in your hives. And so they try to stay spread out on as much. The queen at this point has stopped laying as much, so there's not nearly as much brood to stay on and cover. But if there is brood spread in various places, if it drops to mid-50s, they're going to cluster. There will be some brood you might lose in other parts of the hive, because they're not going to stay with it. Or they might try to stay with it, and you will lose some of those bees because it got too cold for them. Brood rearing stops, and I don't like saying it stops, because I have yet to go into a hive, like I said, here, when it gets 65, 70 degrees in December or January, there have been times I've popped the top on a hive and gone in and looked, and I've got brood, because it's warm enough at times that queens will continue to lay. It's not a lot, it's very small, but they don't necessarily quit laying, but they drastically reduce the amount of brood rearing that's taking place. 42 degrees hits, bees cannot fly. The ambient temperature, they step out onto their landing board and it's 42 degrees. They are not able to vibrate their wing muscles enough to warm up to actually take off. And so now what helps, if you've got your hives face east or south where the sun is hitting them, that's going to give them a little bit more warmth. So even though the ambient temperature may be 42 degrees, that sunshine might warm them up a little bit more. What we see, especially when there's snow on the ground, you go out in your yard and there's a lot of dead bees out on the snow, because as they leave and will land on the snow, a lot of times maybe doing to collect water, as soon as they land on the snow, now it's too cold, they can't fly, they can't get warmed back up enough to fly. And so that's something that you see take place. At 40 degrees, if an individual bee is left to itself, it will die. It's too cold. That's when the necessity of being a part of that cluster is vital. And again, there's no other creature that does what the honeybees do to maintain themselves. They don't hibernate, but to maintain their temperatures, maintain everything that's going on in that hive through the whole winter. and to keep their temperatures up. Here's just an illustration of what it would look like in your hive. If you are running a double deep 10 frame hive in the middle of the winter, this would be probably going into later winter, because you see as the cluster would have started down at the very bottom, and they have cleaned out all of the stores of honey at the bottom as they've moved their way up the hive. Now they are moving into that upper box, and so you can see the core of that, where they illustrate that now they're starting to eat the honey out of that core, the core of that upper box. That's an illustration of what it looks like. Temperature-wise, here's what's going on in that cluster. The very inside of that cluster, they will maintain 93 to 95 degrees all the time, especially if they have brood. Even if there's a little bit of brood, they will maintain that core. It might be 10 below outside, but in the middle of that cluster, it will be 92, 93, 94 degrees, pretty constant. Then there's a layer around them that is between 55 and 60 degrees. Those are the ones that are vibrating their wing muscles. They're not moving their wings, they're just vibrating those muscles to create heat, and that's what is keeping the heat in that core of the cluster. And then all those that are around the outside are just a layer of insulation. The outside of the cluster will get about 41 degrees. And as we said, at 40 degrees, they can't survive on their own. At 41, they're pushing the limits. But then they will rotate in and out of that cluster to allow the ones on the outside to get warmth, the ones on the inside move out, and just as a constant movement through the winter. The honey stores is critical, because that's what gives them, honey is their carbohydrate, so it gives them energy, and so they have to have that to maintain that, able to vibrate those muscles and keep the heat. And so that's what's happening. If you were to lift up the boxes between the two of your hives in the middle of the cluster, that's what it would look like. As they're clustered not just in one box, but they're going to be clustered about the size of a basketball. If you've got a good numbers in your hive, they're in the middle of the hive. So that's a beautiful sight in the middle of the winter. I don't necessarily go and pop my hives apart like that, and when it's cold enough for them to be clustered, but it's kind of cool to be able to see what's going on. So why do bees struggle so much in the wintertime? Here's the dangers. So temperature changes, moisture, varroa, lack of food, and mites. So we're going to look at each one of these kind of in brief and show some things that you can do to try to help keep these things from being a detriment to your bees. So temperature changes. Nothing we can do. It is what it is. It's going to do what it's going to do. I talk a lot about winter before last, when we had that drastic late fall or late spring freeze, and we were we were almost in the 80 degrees. It seemed like we were in the 70s. Everything was great. My long hive, I had 32 frames in my long hive, and I went in the day before the temperature dropped just to peek in, make sure food stores, man, there was honey all throughout that whole thing, except right in the very middle, about the middle 4 or 5 frames, they had eaten out. Everything to the sides, full of honey. So, they're in good shape, not worried about it. Well, when that cold snap hit, they clustered, but they clustered right back in the middle where there was no honey. And even though 2 frames this way and 2 frames that way, there was food, they starved, because it dropped to almost minus 20. And when it's that cold, they will not move. And so they sat there for 2 or 3 days and just starved. It's a weather thing. Not much we can do about it. And those are just some of the headaches that we've got to deal with. Now, I learned my lesson when I opened up that hive the day before it got cold. If I were to do that today, I I would have taken those empty frames out and put all of the full frames where they had previously clustered, because now I know that's where they're probably going to cluster again. And so I've learned a lesson, maybe help them out next time. Should I wrap my hives? Some guys do. Most in this area do not. And one of the reasons for that is because of the temperature fluctuations. So a lot of people, especially in the north, they'll wrap in black, put a black wrapping around it. Well, if you did that here, okay, it was cold, it dropped down and got really, really cold, and that wrap helped keep them a little bit warmer. But 2 days from now, when it goes up to 60 degrees or 70 degrees, you're going to fry your bees. It's going to be too hot. And so there are some guys that do put some different types of insulation wraps, that type of thing on there. Majority around here do not. There's really not. I don't know if there's a benefit or not of doing that. You can talk to guys who do wrap their hives and see what they do and how they do it, how it's worked for them. That's something that's going to be a choice that you just got to make on what you want to do.
How does that affect the Appamate type hives?
I definitely wouldn't worry about wrapping Appamates.
Well, I know that, but is that going to be virtually the same thing?
An Appamate, no, because Appamate, the insulation in Appamate will maintain the temperature on the interior. So when it gets really cold, it keeps them pretty warm on the inside. When it gets warm on the outside, it maintains that internal temperature a lot better. The wraps that go around them are just thin, and really all they're there to do is to collect heat from the sun to try to warm the boxes. Maybe be a little bit of a wind deterrent, but with the Appamates, if you're not familiar with Appamates, they're the insulated hives that are becoming more and more popular, and so I would not be worried. I have not lost a hive in the winter that was sitting in an Appamate hive. So but they've always done really well. I've never lost one in the summer that's been in an Appamate hive either, so that's a pretty good thing too. Come on. You get too far away from my. Oh, never mind. I turned it off. It helps if you don't get it off. If you've been part of the club and meetings over the last year especially, you know how I feel about this. Varroa is the #1 killer of bees. And this is the time of year that things are beginning to get critical with Varroa. Testing and treating is critical in the fall. If you have a high mite load going into winter, starting about this time of year, your mites are doubling in number every month. And so if actually starting about a month ago, when I think I have a chart that they show, back in about actually July, as the bees begin to go down in number, it's when Varroa begin to rise in number. And so it's kind of a two-edged sword. Testing, I am adamant about testing and not just treating. A lot of beekeepers for a long, long time have just treated. They're going to treat in the spring and probably treat in the fall, and because they know they're going to have Varroa. So they just treat. And I emphasize, and I'm taking this off of the people like Jamie Ellis at the University of Florida, the Bee Lab, and all the research that they're doing right now with mite control, is that it is becoming more and more of a problem. And if you don't know what your mite load is going into treatment, and then also know what it is after a treatment, one, how do you know your treatment worked to begin with? And maybe you didn't need to treat. Maybe you didn't need to stress your bees out. And so I know I have rode that horse into the ground, but it is vitally, vitally important. if you do a mite check and you have a 3% or higher mite load, that's three mites for every 100 bees, then you are on the verge of a lot of trouble. And so that is the limit that they have really officially set. There are several who have they see it lower than that. I can't remember his name now. With scientific beekeeping, I can't remember his name. Randy Oliver. If his are above 1%, he treats. After all of his research and everything that he said. And so, there's a lot of different information out there about that. But Varroa, we've talked a lot in the past about Varroa treatments and different ways of doing that. And so, I'm not going to go into detail on that, but it is something to make sure that you're focused on going into the fall. Going into winter, moisture issues are something that have caused problems for many in the past. So when we're setting up our hives, one of the questions that a lot of guys have are, do I need more ventilation in my hives? Some people do, some people don't. Again, if you're brand new to beekeeping, you're going to hear this said many, many times that you ask 10 beekeepers a question, you're going to get about 12 or 15 different answers. Because there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of different ways that have worked. And a lot of it is personal preference, what works best for me, what works best in my bee yards. Ventilation is something, if you're going to try to provide more ventilation in your hive, your inner cover on a regular hive has that little notch that's cut in it. It can be used to turn over and create an upper entrance in the winter time as well. So it will create some air circulation through the hive as well. But it also creates an upper entrance for them. That's an idea. There are beekeepers who go, that looks like it's a solid bottom. I have done both. I have experimented with both. Solid bottoms through the winter, or just leaving the bottoms off and going screen bottoms all the way through the winter. I really didn't have any different result. I know there's some guys here that go screen bottoms all the way through the winter with no problems. And so it just leaves that open, allows a little bit more ventilation for moisture to get out, things like that as well. Just as a side note, going into wintertime, take your entrance reducer and flip it over. And the reason for this, I've never had a problem, but a reason that this is recommended for a just in case is in the wintertime you are losing bees. Bees are dying, and they will begin to drop on the bottom of the hive, on the bottom board. And if your entrance is at the very, very bottom on the floor, over time, if they are clustered enough and you've had enough die out, then that pile of dead bees can completely cover up that entrance. It can cause some problems with them when they are able to try to get in and out. So one thing to try to help that is, I've just heard guys say, flip that entrance reducer over so that it's only, 3/8 of an inch, but it raises that entrance up a little bit so that even if you have some die out, you've got a little bit more time, a little bit more space to give them a way to get in and out if they need to. Moisture absorption is something that helps a lot, and you can do this in various ways. There are quilt boxes that you can build and put together and put on top of your hive. Put some wood chips in it, put some burlap in it, and as the moisture rises, remember it's cold outside, it's warm on the inside, the bees are creating heat, and so just like a glass that condenses water, On the inside of the lid of your hive, it's going to begin to condense water. That water will begin to drop off of the lid, and if there is enough water that drips on your bees and off of that lid, then you can freeze and kill your bees. So we try to avoid allowing that moisture to collect, and this is one way to do it, is to gather that moisture, let it collect inside a quilt box like this. Another option is to tilt your hive a little bit. Just put a little block of wood under the back end of your hive, and it tips a little bit. So what that hopefully will do is, as that water condenses on the lid, then that water will drain down the lid and down the side of the hive instead of just sitting and dripping in the middle on bees. Mountain camp method. This is a feeding method, sugar feeding method, but it also works as a moisture absorption. As the mountain camp method, you put a piece of newspaper right on top of the top frames of your hive, and then you just cover that newspaper with dry sugar, and as the moisture comes up, it will soak in. As a matter of fact, just within a few days, that sugar on top will be hardened. It'll be almost like a rock because how much moisture is already collected in it. And so, but it will continue to collect moisture, but it also serves as an additional feeding method as well, which I'll bring that back up here in just a moment when we get to that, which I guess we're there. Lack of food. Feeding in the fall, feeding right now is key, especially if your bees are light right now. There's not a lot of nectar out there right now. And so with us being in a time of year, in a dearth, where they're not able to collect natural nectar, we do try to help supply them with as much help as we can. So we feed 2 to 1, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, and to help them to have a solution that is as easily available for them to store as possible. And so get your feeders in any way that you decide to do that. There's all kinds of ways that you can give them the sugar water.
When do you switch to the 2 to 1?
I would be switching to 2 to 1. If not now, very soon. And just because, especially if you're heavy, if you've got good weight right now, they're going to be using a lot of their stores now still because there's not a lot out there to collect. And so last summer was a really bad summer for me, where I was feeding 2 to 1 probably from the middle of August on, and they were using it faster than they were storing it. And so I went into winter really light last year. I would say putting it on now is, you're not going to do any harm by doing that. Ideally, we want them to have natural honey to be able to take through winter if they have enough. And we want to leave them enough and not harvest that. Leave them enough to have it. But sometimes they go through it and they need additional to be able to make it through the winter. If you have 80 to 100 pounds, that's usually the amount they say. If your hives weigh 80 to 100 pounds going into winter, it's pretty good. That's a good enough amount of honey or sugar water solution that they have stored up to be able to survive a winter. Providing emergency food. If you get towards the end of winter and they're running out, in the middle of winter, and you're lifting your hives, one way to check is just to go around, and as winter starts, when they're at their heaviest, just give it a feel to see how heavy. Just pick up the back end of your hive. See how heavy that is. You're going to be able to gauge throughout the winter by doing that same test, just how is the weight changing. If it gets to a point you go out there and you lift it and you're like, oh man, that's really, really light. That's a lot different than it was. You might be in a place where you need emergency feed, just to make sure There's not really a way that we can, if it's still dropping down into freezing temperatures, you can't put liquid feed in. Or you can, but it's not a very good idea. And so we go to other methods of what they need are the carbohydrates. And so one of the things that we do is that mountain camp method. As I said, we'll put the newspaper down, put the sugar on top, and if you did that early in the fall, it's collected moisture and helped you out in that way. But now it's also there for them to go up and to be able to access to get a little bit more of the carbohydrates that they need as they're trying to finish getting through the winter. Fondant, what we're going to be doing October 1st in our field day is making fondant. Fondant is a sugar, it's cooked down, I'm not going to remember I'm going to get it mixed up. Sugar, raw white sugar is glucose, correct? If nobody tells me, that's what we're going to say then. Whichever it is. The bees have to have sucrose to be able to process in their bodies. And so they can take raw sugar and process it. They have to collect water, and it takes a lot more for them to process that to get it to be usable. Fondant, we've already taken it through that process. We're cooking it down, basically doing it like making candy. Like if you've ever made candy in a pot, we've got our candy thermometer in there and everything. So we're measuring temperatures to get it dehydrated down, and that heat is also changing the fructose into the sucrose. I believe that's what it is. And we are helping them so that fondant like this that we make is much more usable for them to digest than just raw sugar. They can process the raw sugar and use it if they absolutely need it. This just helps them, they don't have to expend as much energy to use this as they do raw sugar. And so it does help out if you're able to do it. It's not a necessity, but it is a good tool to use. Candy boards. I've used candy boards several times. Just about every year I've got a candy board at least on one hive. That is a candy board I made a couple of years ago. And all that is raw sugar. Just a little bit of water and sugar mixed up, packed into a frame. It's about 2 inches tall. And you see I put some blocks of wood in those two corners and on that other side just to allow some air circulation up there in that, and also allows the bees to get up through that. Now they can eat it from underneath as well, because underneath I've just got 1/2 inch wire screen on the bottom of it, and which you can kind of barely see in those corners. And so they have access to it, but that just allows maybe a little bit more circulation. I don't know if that's absolutely necessary, but I saw a guy do it and I thought it was a good idea. So that's how I put it together. When I put my candy boards down, I do put a couple of sticks, a couple of pieces of wood down across the frames. That keeps the candy board up off of the frames a little bit more instead of sitting right down on the frames themselves. It allows the bees to be able to move underneath that candy board if they need to. So as far as feeding is concerned, those are just some options. One, be feeding going through fall before we get to winter to try to get their weight up. Feed that 2-to-1 sugar water. And if you absolutely need something else later on in the winter, you've got some of those other options that are available. Mice. They love beehives. And it's a perfect winter home because it is nice and cozy and warm. And there's a lot of food in those hives for them to munch on because they love the honey just as much as the bees need the honey. And they'll probably chew on a few bees too if they absolutely need to. So in the spring, if you are not careful, you might open the top of your hive and you'll find something like that. where they've made a nest, and it can just create a mess in your hive. Not necessarily, well, there's a chance if it gets a little too big of a problem in there, the bees might abscond. They might just leave the hive because it's just too unlivable. It can create some problems. Best way is just simply to put some mouse guards. Mouse guards are simple. There are metal ones that you can buy. Those are big enough. The holes are big enough for the bees to go in and out of, but mice cannot. You can make your own. Get a piece of 1/4 inch mesh or wire and make your own. It's an easy way to do it. If you use 1/2 inch, mice can squeeze through a 1/2 inch. So you got to get 1/4 inch. If you go 1/8 of an inch, the bees can't get through it. So 1/4 of an inch, the bees can go through, but the mice cannot. You can buy some of these entrances. I bought some of these and they've worked really well. They didn't last very long. They lasted me a couple seasons and then I had to replace them. But I like them because these are kind of like the Apamay hives. Apamay hives come with mouse guards already built into them with little slides you can slide to open the entrance, bigger or smaller. And I love those entrances. And so I saw these on Amazon. I thought, oh, I'm going to get some of those. They work the same way. They work pretty good. The problem was they started to kind of, I guess the temperature fluctuations started then to kind of bend a little bit, deform, and bees and other things were beginning to get in other parts and not just through the entrance where they're supposed to be using. So, just a little bit of prep, a little bit of work going into the fall and into the winter can make a big, big difference. Now, I dream of snows like that. I would love for my bee yard to be covered in snow like that all winter long. If we get a big snow, the only thing you'd want to do is go out and maybe knock some snow off at the entrance, because if it does warm up a little bit and they decide they want to get out and do a cleansing flight and go to the bathroom or something like that, then that allows them to be able to do that. But do not remove all the snow from around your hive if we got snow that was anything like that, because that is a super good insulator. And so it's snow, it's cold, but that's better than cold wind. And so you see these guys up north that in their beehives, they love this because this is their winter wrap that they put on their hives. And so, but if you just prepare a little bit as you're going into winter, then you're doing your bees a whole lot of good, and you have a much better chance of actually having something moving around in your hive in the spring when you go to look at them. And so, any questions? Any other thoughts? Anything else? Yes.
Back to ventilation. I've heard people talk about lifting the cover and putting like a coin underneath each 4 corners.
Mm-hmm.
Will the bees propolis that up then, or will they let the air flow?
Probably not, because they don't make a lot of propolis in the winter. And most of the time in the wintertime, that's why I don't even like to crack my hives in the wintertime and pull anything apart, because they're not able to seal everything back up. And so, no, if I've heard that too, I've heard guys doing that too, and that, I'm sure that's a good way to create a little bit of airflow of being able to get in and get out of there as well with that inner cover. I've not done that, but I can see how that would create a little bit of a gap to be able to allow some ventilation.
I've never had it to seal up the crack like that in the top.
Yeah.
I guess because it's cold. they can't make the propolis.
Yeah. Do you do something like that?
Yeah, I've never had the bees plug it up.
Yeah.
Propolis.
Probably makes more sense to tilt it like you mentioned. At least you probably keep less of a cold air flow going through it and solve the issue. of
Yeah, one of the things Tom Seeley in a lot of his research discovered was it's not the interior of the box temperature that is really a concern. The biggest concern is moisture and now our mite loads, because they're going to maintain those temperatures in that cluster pretty much no matter what. And when you actually take and see the temperatures in the box above and below that cluster, it's frigid, cold. And so they're not really warming the box much at all. It's the cluster staying warm that's really the key. And for a long time it was thought that as that cluster warms, it's keeping everything inside warm as well, and that's what we've got to be careful with and everything. And but Tom Seeley, through a lot of his research, he came to conclusions like interior of the box temperature really is not the big concern. It's just making sure they have enough food to keep that cluster warm. And so giving them a little bit of ventilation. I think Jeff, you screen bottom all year, don't you? All the way through winter, and has great success. So that's an open screen bottom in the bottom of the hive all the way through winter. And so even with wind blowing and everything else, the cluster is going to keep itself the temperature it needs. And so, yeah, I don't know if maybe other parts of the country that might be different. But I know several guys here that, like I said, last year I went through with all open bottoms, and did well last winter. So. Anything else?
What else did you, on your long lane, did you do to prep for winter?
Feed. So I've got feed on them right now. I really didn't do anything different than I do in a regular hive. But they had enough honey that I didn't even put any additional, I didn't put any candy boards. Mine is built so that I could put a candy board in there if I wanted to, on top of them. But I've never done that because that long hive, for some reason, they know how to pack the honey in that thing. And they've always done really well doing that. And so, but just, I've got in my inner cover pieces, because I've got the slats that I use for inner covers, I've got 3 of them that have screens. And so that allows for ventilation. I've got screens in my lid, in my roof. And so that allows for ventilation. And so I've never had any moisture issues. I've never even really had to try to tip it anyway.
Yeah, some of the, I'm curious too, some of the, videos and stuff on the long lanes, they talk about like putting that foam insulation on the top of
Yeah.
the boards.
Yeah.
Did it seem to be?
With mine, I don't think it would do much different. Because I've got that space of air between my roof and the inner cover boards. Yeah. So, I mean, it might. Any insulation is going to add a little bit of something. So, but I never have, and my long hive, I've not. Other than that one issue I had, I haven't really had a problem with them. So, long hives are a little bit different of an animal, and learning how to. It's the same principles. It's just a little bit different because it's different from the vertical. Yep.
Early this spring, I've had a few people tell me that their bees was dead, and right above the bees was honey. And I consider that they just couldn't break the cluster to get to the honey.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and Like I said, that's what I found in my long hive, and that's one of the hard things. And I think maybe that might be a benefit for us here, because we do get warm days when we could go in if we needed to. If we're gonna have a really cold snap come through, and it's 60 degrees, 55, 60 degrees, it might be a good idea to go in, see where they've emptied frames, and put full frames in the place of those empty frames. Move empty frames to the outside, maybe, or wherever they have emptied frames, especially in the bottom box. That's probably where they're going to cluster the first time when it gets cold again, because that's where they clustered the first time. And so, again, that's not a guarantee. They may decide to cluster somewhere else completely different the next time. But I think, from my experience, they tend to go back to the original spot they started their cluster in. And so moving some frames around to make sure that they've got honey in those locations, I think would be a wise thing. If you've got extra, maybe after your honey harvest, you kept out some frames so that you can have them to throw in there later on in the winter, might be a good thing to do too.
How do you make your 2-to-1 sugar water? Some people do weight, some people do.
It's almost identical. And so if it ends up being 2.1 to 1, you're probably gonna be okay. Because I've heard guys do up to as much as 3 to 1. And your bees this time of year, any of you have neighbors, anybody that have hummingbird feeders that let you know? You've got both. Have you had bees on your hummingbird feeders at all? Some of them are hard because it's so much further in, they can't get to it. But we had a lady here at church that came and said, "How do I keep bees off of my hummingbird feeders?" And I think that's 7 to 1. So what the hummingbird?
4 to 1.
What's that?
4 to 1.
4 to 1. Okay. So, but it's still a lot more. That's double than what we would use. And if it's sugar, the bees want it. That's why, especially this time of year, you're outside with a can of Coke, that you're gonna probably eventually have a bee try to find it, because they can smell it and they're gonna try to find the sugar. When we talk about feeding, you got all the feeders in the hive that you can use, but you can also do open feeding, and that's usually more commercial guys are going to be doing that. I have made some open feeders and done open feeding, putting it about 100 yards away from my bee yard. I know in doing that, I know my bees are finding it, but I also know everybody else. I know Jeff's bees are probably finding it too. And so everybody else all around the neighborhood, all their bees, they're all finding my feeders as well. So you can pay me for that later.
Yeah, appreciate it.
And not a problem. But you're about to be set up really good with all that farm going in there next to you. I'm going to be bringing some of my bees and putting them in your yard. So some of those people ask me, say, what can I do to help the bees? And I'll tell them, put a bowl of sugar water out on your back porch and put some rocks or something in it for them to land on so they don't drown in it. And they'll come back and say, oh, it was just like swarmed with bees. Yeah, they'll do that. But it's kind of fun when you start getting other people involved, and of course they think that they're just really, really helping the bees by putting a small little bowl of sugar water out there. But it's fun to at least give people the awareness of the needs that are out there. Anything else? You got anything?
I was just thinking, we talk about, you would think we have a really friendly climate here because we don't get really, really cold, but it actually can be even a lot harder because our bees tend to be more active, or they can be active during the winter, and then we use so many more stores than they would be in Vermont or up north where it's consistently cold.
Yeah.
Last year was tough, and I went through all of my hives. I treated, and I took my treatment out last weekend, I think last Saturday, and I went through my hives yards are in bad shape for stores. I'll start feeding this weekend. I had really corn syrup. Another one that was doing pretty well. Both of my Apamay hives are in the yard with almost no stores, and they're both full of honey. I think there is something. Has Cayman said anything about his Apamay test yard? Yeah.
I haven't heard a whole lot this year.
I think he was running a 50 Apamay hive
Yeah.
test yard this year. I think it was 50 hives.
Yeah. Apamay, I think, donated him those hives for that test yard. Boy, hate to be him.
It's completely different. They're completely different. I've got, I think, 10 hives in that yard, and 2 of them are Apamays, and the Apamays are the only ones that I won't worry about those bees going into winter.
And they just act different. On a 110-degree day, they're not bearding outside the hive. They're just different. And I think that's more the way, they're not cheap, but it's more the way a lot of guys are going. Yep.
When you're doing the 2-to-1 ratio, when do you stop doing that? Just when it starts to freeze
Yeah.
or a certain temperature?
When you start getting into freezing temperatures, and that's usually when we start to pull our syrup off of them.
Would be a good way to store any extra anything you have that you say before the
Yeah.
warehouse.
You can just put them in a box, and you can store them anywhere where temperature's, pretty regulated. So even if it's not, set them in the garage. So as long as you want to keep wax moths out of them.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about. How do I keep stuff out? Is there a good container type?
They actually do make frame containers that are airtight and will seal and lock down. They're just plastic tubs
Okay.
that are the exact size for Langstroth frames, and you just drop the frames in there. It's got a ledge on both sides to drop them in there and to store them. You can, but wrap them up in plastic bags or you can throw them in your freezer if you got room.
It's a good idea to freeze them anyway for at least 72 hours.
I've
Yeah.
got some that are frozen right now. What I've been doing is taking them out, freezing a few, and then putting them back in the ice because those don't have critters in them.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of rotating it a little bit.
Sure.
but-
I tried something last year that worked really well. I took and I stacked my boxes, and I put an LED light over the top of them and just kept them lit up all winter long, and I had no problems, and I did not freeze those.
Really?
If you have a place outside where it's even exposed to the outside, you can stack your boxes, taking them and stacking them back and forth crossways, because that allows light to get down in there. Wax moths do not like light, so I've heard a lot of guys say that has kept the wax moths out. So they're not sealing them; they're just stacking them back and forth to allow light to be able to get into the boxes, and they've had really good luck doing that.
There's a lot of people that talk about taking and stacking the boxes and then putting moth crystals
Yeah.
in the boxes, not moth balls, moth crystals.
Right.
And that's supposed to keep them knocked down, but my father-in-law a couple years ago he pulled a honey super that was pretty full, and he wasn't gonna extract it, so he just wrapped it up in a black plastic bag and threw it in the spare bedroom. He's gonna put it back on the hive for the winter, and when he opened it up, there had been, eggs or larvae from wax moths. When he put it in there, he had to throw the whole frames, box away. It was such a mess.
Yeah. This is the time of year when I started having all the trouble with wax moths. So if you see anything that's beginning to look like wax moths, little wax moth larvae, you see them starting to burrow through the comb, start to see some of the webbing or some of the what's that? But also cocoons that they usually attach cocoons to the wood,
Yeah.
because they actually will dig out a little bit of that wood.
Yeah,
When you start seeing any of that, you need to immediately yank it. Anything that's got any of that out of there, throw it in the freezer, kill everything off, and get everything cleaned out. Because it devastated me last year. And And so just a little bit of time of neglect, and I lost 5 hives to wax moths last summer. And so they can take over fast if you don't deal with it.
Going in with honey or, you know, something for the grease. I lost 3 hives last winter, and the first one I lost during the winter, and I'm 99% sure I went into winter, queen was in that hive. And then if you remember last spring, you know, we had all of that cold and we got some warm weather. I went through, I did, inspected all of my hives, and then we got a 4 or 5 day really, really cold snap. I lost 2 hives in that spring cold snap. And it was a tough year last year. I think this year was tough in more of my bee yards, but last year was really tough because we got that long, brutal dearth again. It was just a surprise. My hives were full of honey from the spring, and I went in, it was after about 6 weeks, and they were all but empty. So I had to feed heavily.
I was talking to one of the guys at Garden City, the nursery in Bentonville. They were talking about that cold snap a year and a half ago, two winters ago, that set back everything. So plants that would not produce, they were not putting out pollen, they were not putting out nectar, they were not, and at the end of this year, they were just starting to recover from that. And we as beekeepers, we noticed it last year because we had that hard freeze, and then we had a really bad year of nectar and just bringing anything in all last season. And so we as beekeepers noticed it, and that verified it. They've struggled with the plants, and it says it's probably something that happens that late, a hard freeze like that late. It can be 2, 3, 4 years before everything recovers, and it's just kind of interesting. We just happen to do something that notices that probably before most other people do.
You know, back on the topic of light testing, I saw, you know, recently, I think Australia was the only country in the world that didn't have varroa mites, and they do not have varroa.
Yeah.
They found varroa in Australia, so they're taking a potentially really harsh stand on it, eliminating bee yards and trying to eradicate it. I don't think they will.
Yeah, it was said for a long time that every beehive in the world has varroa except in Australia. And I heard something about that too, that Australia, they decided to join the club. So we'll see if they're able to do it. I don't think they will be able to.
I don't think they will.
But, all right, well, we got a 50-50. Did you draw a ticket?
Yep, we got 3150